Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I speak with Tara Smith. Tara is a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Texas here in Austin. She's also the BB&T Chair for the Study of Objectivism. And I was really excited to speak with her about this philosophy, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, because several of our guests are fans of Ayn Rand and believers in objectivism. And it's a subject that I really don't know that much about. So I hope you enjoy this deeply philosophical conversation. Tara, I'm excited to talk to you today because since we started having these conversations with the Emergent Order podcast, several of our guests from a lot of different disciplines have cited Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged as being very important for the formation of their ideology, their inspiration, and I, for being someone who is a fairly passionate classical liberal, have relatively little understanding or exposure to Ayn Rand and her ideas. I did not yet read Atlas Shrugged, which when I told John Mackey that, he was absolutely aghast.
That's good to hear.
When I found out from Tal, the president of the Ayn Rand Institute, that you were here in Austin, it was just such a great opportunity to selfishly get get sort of a high speed connection into her philosophy.
At least some connection. Sure.
So thanks for.
Sure. No, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate your kind of trying to go to the source in a way by talking to ARI and all.
And I'd love to just start off by, asking you how you discovered her ideas. You're a philosophy professor at the University of Texas, which it's wonderful that they haven't found a way to expel you.
This is true. This is true. Sure. So I became interested in Rand back late in high school. So it predated my becoming a philosophy professor. But I was raised Catholic and I went to Catholic school, grammar school, and high school. And I think I was still a junior in high school when someone said, I think you'd like this book, or I think you'd like this author. And I read The Fountainhead, and indeed, I liked it a lot. And I was starting to realize right away, oh, this is a very different philosophy from what I've been raised on and what I had completely believed. I mean, I was a good Catholic in many respects. Um, at any rate, so late in high school, junior, senior year, I read the major novels and some Atlas Shrugged, Fountainhead, and some of Rand's nonfiction essays, primarily on ethical, moral, and political philosophy issues. And I quickly uh, abandoned the Catholicism and thought this philosophy makes a lot of sense. But I went on to college. I started out as a government major, ended up double majoring in philosophy and government. And then increasingly was drawn toward philosophy as a study. And eventually it dawned on me, you could make a living doing this. I particularly remember I was in the office of a particular professor who I liked very much. And I took like 3 different courses with him. I thought he was really good. I would go sometimes during office hours, talk to him about issues I was really interested in and wanted to make headway on. And it simply dawned on me one day, wow, he's on the other end of this, he's behind his desk. And this is what he does for a living. I could do that. So then I decided to go into philosophy. Um, and, and then the rest is grad school. And first job out of grad school was UT here in Austin. And I'm extremely lucky, really fortunate, and I've been really happy studying and teaching philosophy.
It's interesting that, one of the first things you bring up is, and I was raised Catholic and I still consider myself to be Catholic.
You say you still consider yourself? I just didn't hear the word.
I do. I still consider myself to be Catholic, although in light of the challenges that the church has had with the priesthood, it definitely makes it harder and harder. I'm sort of a lapsed Catholic. Arthur Brooks has tried desperately to. He's been highly evangelical towards me about being a more active, more practitioner as a Catholic. But it seems like um, religion or abandoning religion is a theme I've seen repeated from several folks have come to Rand, and I find that kind of interesting. Why did that happen for you? Why is that one of the first things that you bring up as being a
Well, I
change
think it's
that
one of
you
the
point
first
out?
things I bring up simply because in the lives of many people, a religion is a philosophy, right? It's the way you see the world. It's the way it frames what you view as real, what you view as important, as having value, giving you a framework for how you're supposed to lead your life. So I think it, I mean, I find it very natural given that I mean, some people aren't raised on a particular philosophy or religion, but I was. I mean, again, I went to 12 years of Catholic school. My father
Yep.
was a devout Catholic, who I respected very much, including after I left the church and all. So it was the way I saw things. And that was replaced by this philosophy of objectivism. So in that sense, it's not that I had some either then had or in a certain way even today have some animus against religion per se, but it was the stand-in for a philosophy, the religious mystical sort of philosophy, which now this secular philosophy has replaced in my mind in terms of giving me an outlook on and a way of addressing the big picture questions. I mean, I see it's an interesting question that you raise, and I don't know if you have pursued with some of the others as well. It may be only after, 4 or 5 people who talk about their objectivism also bring up religion that you realize, there's a pattern here, so maybe I should probe it. But I'd be very interested in what the others say as to why, it figures prominently in their minds. But I don't know. It seems
Yeah.
an innocent enough reason in my case, at least. But
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's others who I've spoken to about it have pointed to, the centrality of reason
mm,
and the pursuit of objective reality. And obviously, this is the stuff we're going to probe into in this conversation. But
mhm.
obviously, faith and belief in whether it's Christ or the God of Abraham, those leaps of faith are of a different category than that kind of reason altogether. So if you're going to say, well, you've got to base your understanding of the world on reason, it doesn't leave a does. It's interesting. It on one level, it doesn't. At first hand, it seems like it doesn't leave a lot of room for faith. But then when I did talk to John Allison quite a bit about this, and
Uh-huh.
his take on that was, they're sort of category differences, so they're not necessarily incompatible, but that he might be a little more fusionist than others on that regard. I mean,
I think so.
how do you regard the compatibility of, can you be an objectivist and maintain faith in or belief in God?
I don't think no, you can't be an objectivist and believe in faith in anything. Now, we can talk about what I mean by faith and what it is and isn't, and how it's often understood in very elastic, gauzy terms, such that anytime you have confidence in anything, whatever the grounds, people call it faith. But I mean, essentially, faith is believing in the absence of evidence or contrary to the evidence. Reason is the attempt to go by evidence and logic. I mean, so in very fundamental terms, um, I think if you cut to the essence of what each is, they're completely incompatible. I mean, I can try to go by the evidence. Now, again, I may not be perfect at it. I may make mistakes when I try to go by the evidence. I can misunderstand and misinterpret the evidence, and I can draw erroneous inferences. But the person of reason is dedicated to trying to get things right, trying to understand the way things really are on the basis of perceptual observation and logical inferences from that. Whereas the person of faith or dedication to the method of faith says, even if you don't have evidence, or even sometimes when the evidence doesn't add up to this, I'm just going to believe that he walked on water, or that he turned the water into wine, or, I'm just going to believe that. That's incompatible.
It's been very interesting for me as a parent because my son is very logic driven.
Mm.
He was very spirited as a boy, and as a young man, he's 14. He's become very philosophical. I mean,
Uh-huh.
one of his seventh grade books that he chose to read was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
And it's funny. That book had an unbelievable quieting effect on him. I think in a lot of ways.
Wow.
But I I definitely struggle, and my wife and I have sort of slightly different takes on our approach to God.
Mm-hmm.
And given that he's prone to try to reason his way through his understanding of the world,
Mm-hmm.
I think he's fairly agnostic, and it's hard, there isn't really a logical path there. I tend to find myself in a kind of God of the gaps sort of discussion with him, and my wife, who has a far more visceral sense of the spiritual world. Well, her and I come at him from two very different directions, and it's just an interesting challenge.
So you're saying she is the more spiritual or religious?
Oh, and I've asked Arthur about Arthur, Brooks about this, and he quipped something that I'd never heard before. He said, "Well, don't you know, Dad gets you to church and Mom gets you to heaven."
I haven't heard that one either.
No,
Let me say though, let me come back to your son, because now the poor kid, we're like analyzing him here. I feel like Frasier on the headset or something. Um, I think though, I mean, one thing you mentioned is he really seems to be trying to reason these things through. I forget if that was your exact language, but you said something like that.
Yep.
That is terrific. And that is the exact kind of thing that objectivism and Ayn Rand applauds and encourages. That is, do your own thinking, but think. And I think part of what was interesting to me, going back to, yeah, as a kid growing up, I bought the Catholicism and so on, is that once I had these radically different views presented to me and just started questioning and challenging, it wasn't like, oh, okay, Catholicism, I mean, it wasn't an immediate kind of quick overnight decision, Catholicism all wrong, Ayn Rand all right, or something like that. But it was rather, oh, she opened up a way of asking logical questions about a lot of the things that I had believed and that everybody around me, the people I loved and respected, had believed. And part of what I realized was, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. How do I even mean? What is it to believe this stuff? Some of these doctrines, they really don't make any sense once you question them a little. So part of what I think had happened for me, and I do think this happens for a number of people, and you needn't be raised in a particular religion for this to happen, is we don't we don't think for ourselves very much. We believe what we're supposed to believe. What the people around us believe, be it the parents or the kids at school. And again, this goes on whether we're 6 years old or 14 years old like your son, or 24 or 34. There's just a lot of, well, you kind of go by convention and you think in quotes the same thing that everybody else thinks, or everybody else says, or the respectable newspapers, whichever those are in your household, whatever those guys tend to say. So, I mean, one of the actual virtues, one of the moral virtues, according to Rand's moral theory, is independence. And a lot of that is, I mean, part of it is making your own way materially in the world, but um, even more fundamental in a way is making your own way by thinking for yourself, trying to figure things out for yourself, which requires a certain patience, because there are periods in which I don't yet know enough, or I can't tell. I don't have enough information yet. I don't have some of the knowledge that I might need and so on to make to draw considered conclusions. But if I may offer you parental advice, let your kid think for himself and think it through and talk it through. And I don't know, that sounds very good.
I mean, that's been my I don't feel like I have much of a choice on that if I'm going to be a good parent, because having not sent him to 12 years of Catholic school like I went through, he's now at that point where he has to, if he's gonna, whether he's gonna ultimately have a a faith or a religion in his life is going to be a choice entirely up to him.
Right, but I think that's in the nature of the beast in a certain sense, right? Suppose you tried to browbeat him or really tried to took all sorts of means, devious and other, to try to, twist this kid into believing what you want him to believe or what your wife wants him to believe. He wouldn't really believe. He'd end up, I mean, if he had to abdicate on his own judgment about these things, at bottom, he'd be going along for one reason or another, maybe faking it to himself as well as to you, sort of deceiving himself into pretending that he believes. But there's no such thing as believing under the duress of somebody else's force. I can make you say something, but I can't make you believe it. I can make you, I can put a gun to your head and or intimidate you in certain ways to get you to say what I want you to say about God or about anything else. You know, I can be the the Texas Aggie at A&M who says, A&M rocks, A&M rocks. I can't get somebody from UT to believe that if they don't really believe that. I've got to persuade him through reasoning, argument, letting him do his own processing of the reasoning and argument that I'm giving.
So, start to lay out for me what is objectivism? Like, what are the core tenets? Is there a singular starting point?
Okay, good questions. Um, there are a few ways you could come at it in terms of its core tenets. Let me just reel off a few and then I'll elaborate on each, but I'll just reel out a few words. Reality, reason, rational selfishness, individual rights. So if you want to think of R's, there are a lot of R's there. That just happens to be the case. Okay, there's nothing magical about the letter R. It's a philosophy, and I mean, maybe even there we should begin. It's a philosophy. It's a whole philosophy. It's not just a political philosophy or just a moral theory, though it's in many ways most known in one or the other of those realms, right? Rand is very well known as an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism and as an advocate of selfishness. But it all starts really at the metaphysical and epistemological level. It's theory of what's real, what exists, and it's theory of knowledge. That's epistemology, how we can know things, what distinguishes knowing from simply believing or having opinions and so on. So it's a very realist philosophy, completely, in that it accepts that there are facts that are not of our choosing or our making, that exist independently of what we think about them, whether we'd like it to be the case. Man is mortal, for instance. And all the wishing and hoping or believing or misunderstanding in the world doesn't change certain facts of reality. And we can only navigate reality successfully if we accept that things are what they are. The law of identity. A is A. It correspondingly takes a very causal perspective on the universe. Try to understand why things happen by examining the nature of the interacting things. Okay. It's committed to reason. So the epistemological branch of philosophy, you might say, as opposed to faith, what we were talking about a few minutes ago, as opposed to any form of mysticism or emotionalism or elevating whatever the group thinks or whatever the majority thinks or whatever tradition has held. No, it can be interesting and sometimes informative to try to understand, why was this the traditional belief, or why do most people think such and such? But things are what they are independently of people's beliefs, be it an individual's belief or a large group of people's beliefs. Reason, again, is the method that's dedicated to observation, evidence, and logical inference from that, modeled more on the, we talk about the scientific method, in the sciences. And the guts of that method are really the guts of a proper epistemology, a proper theory of knowledge. So it goes by reason, rejects faith, rejects mysticism. And then when it comes to the value areas of philosophy, such things as moral philosophy, political philosophy, even aesthetics, it draws out from the nature of man what we must value in order to live and prosper and succeed. So I think one of the really revolutionary things that Rand does in her moral thinking is she doesn't just, there have been all sorts of competing theories, secular and religious, over the centuries about how man should lead his life. Should one follow Immanuel Kant and deontologists? Should one follow divine law, so-called? Should one follow the greatest good of the greatest number, the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham or many contemporary theorists and so on, rather than simply, rush in with another candidate or saying, well, I support these aspects of Aristotle, but these aspects of some other theory. Rand says we need to step back and ask the question, what is morality all about in the first place? Why do we even have this thing? Why do we have this concept or these concepts of good and bad or good and evil, right and wrong, should and should not, in the moral sense of should and should not? So one I think really terrific reading that I would recommend is in her thin book called The Virtue of Selfishness. The opening chapter is called The Objectivist Ethics. And that's a terrific introduction to her whole way of coming at ethics, which asks, why be moral in the first place? Now, her point isn't to say we shouldn't be moral, but her point is to say that unless we know what the hell we're doing this for, making these distinctions for, saying good boy, bad boy, or, I should do this, I should do that, that's valuable, that's not. Unless we know why we're even making these distinctions, we can't come up with sensible answers to how you should lead your life. So that's a long way of getting to the point that even in her moral philosophy, the ultimate answers that she then gives as to why we need to draw these distinctions and think about shoulds, that too is based on our actual nature, facts that we have needs, that human beings have needs, and only certain ways of acting are going to fulfill those needs. So in the same way that most of us can recognize in the medical realm, yeah, there are things that are good for us, there are things that are bad, things that are nutritious, things that are toxic. There are ways of taking better care of yourself or worse care of yourself for the sake of health and longevity and so on. And not just longevity in the sense of having the longest possible stretch from the day you're born till the day you die, but a healthy, flourishing, able life and so on. Well, similarly, in the moral realm, we can observe certain facts about our needs that give rise to certain kinds of actions, behaviors, virtues, ways of thinking and acting that are most conducive to our fulfilling our needs. Individual rights is the sort of the linchpin of her political theory, and we can talk more about that if you want later. But anyway, that's sort of quick insight into the key doctrines, I would say, of the objectivist philosophy.
So to try to dig in there on something that I find very interesting and that I am not sure I want to hear more about, because I'm not sure I necessarily buy is that okay, so there's this underlying notion of human nature that you're referencing and that you're saying she relies on, and that is being treated as reality, as a fact. Mm-hmm. And I'm not especially postmodern, but how do we know what human nature is? There's a lot of different way. I think it's a pretty contentious thing to claim what that nature is. I do think there is human nature. I think it's, again, as a parent, it's shocking that anyone would claim that we are born a blank slate, a kind of beige blob of clay to be molded by our social context and our upbringing. I mean, those things obviously matter, but
well, okay.
Yeah, what is human nature in her view, and how can she have so much confidence about it?
In many ways, what I mean is fairly pedestrian. That is, I'm not dressing up human nature, or I don't think that she does, sort of. I want to say both something deflationary here, but I don't want to lose the fact that there is human nature. But part of what she's talking about is, okay, don't feed your kid. That's not going to go. That's not going to, I mean, we have physical needs. We have physical needs for a certain amount of calories, for certain vitamins, and all right, for exercise will atrophy, or we'll get, we have needs for hygiene to keep the bugs out and infection out and so on. I mean, they may seem pretty pedestrian, and I mean, they are in many ways, and we've done such a good job at meeting some of our needs so thoughtlessly that it can be easy, particularly in our society, to forget, yeah, no, but the these are actual needs, meaning without the satisfaction of which you will, ultimate, get sick and die. We have
Sure.
we have spiritual needs as well. Now, what I mean by that, spirit, she uses the term spiritual, and she says, "Look, I don't mean anything mystical or supernatural or Twilight Zone, but our minds have needs. It's not just our bodies, our liver or our lungs or some of the the physical organs of the body. They have needs. The kind of mind that a human being has needs as well. Needs for such things as education. I mean, that's not a physical thing, right? But yeah, you need knowledge. You need to understand certain things. You need, now let me just realize, you can have spiritual needs for art, for friends, for inspiration. You mentioned some of the other people you've spoken with talking about having been inspired by some of the fiction of Ayn Rand or whatever. We have needs for self-confidence. So there are a bunch of things that we need. Obviously, one can debate, and I mean, arguments need to be given for saying, this is one of the needs of human being. Self-esteem, that's overrated. People don't really need to think well of themselves. And there are arguments to be had and evidence to be brought to those. So it's not that one can just intuit this is human nature, as if from some tablet that was handed down from the sky. But there is an essential nature. I think what a lot of these add up to is, no, there's an essential nature of human beings, which is different in kind from the essential nature of certain other living organisms that have their own essential nature. For instance, one of the beliefs of objectivism is that we are volitional beings, that our minds don't work automatically, that the individual is at the helm. I mean, again, once he's beyond a certain very small age, right? The human being is in control of what he does with his mind. He has free will, and that's a fact, an important fact of our nature that needs to be taken into account in all sorts of things. Like, for instance, when we mete out punishments to people or hold them accountable for certain things or try to instill a sense of responsibility in kids and so on.
I'm reminded of, and this is the area where I have far more personal exposure.
Mm-hmm.
The thinking and the sort of methodology of Ludwig von Mises, and I know that she, at least at some point or for some period of time, was an admirer of his work, and his sort of approach to economics is feels like it rhymes with what you're saying, which is to say that people desire to improve their lives, and that's a basic rule. That what that improvement is subjective to their own aims and purposes and plans, but that we are by nature always seeking to improve our circumstances, and that at any given time there's certain things that you can make reasonable assumptions about as being true, such as I would rather have satisfaction today than wait tomorrow. So if I have to wait until tomorrow, there's a cost there, and if you're gonna convince me to wait till tomorrow, you might need to pay me some interest, for example. And so he sort of starts with these set of sort of human nature assumptions that, on their face are pretty reasonable. They're not super complicated. They don't take a lot of math or a lot of complicated assumptions. They're simple assumptions. People they want to be gratified. They want to pursue their purposes, and the sooner the better. and from there builds a and then of course, and then I think the other one, which also feels like it really like that you mentioned, is that knowledge and choice and decision making resides only in an individual mind. There are no such thing as sort of group choices. There are things that emerge out of groups, but that there is no hive mind. There is no we chose. There is no America decided. That's not, that's like a shorthand that is largely dangerous and confusing. And
let me pick up on several things in there, if I may. So first, I guess going back to human nature, Rand does not think, and I think this is where a lot of people who have some sympathy for her moral and political views misunderstand her or read into her something that they may think that she does not think. She does not think that everybody always does pursue their self-interest. I mean, I think we see that. Now, I am no great student of economics, so please take this for what it's worth with that important disclaimer, okay? But it seems to me that a lot of times in discussion of economic issues, people assume, oh, well, everybody's just self-interested. And of course, that's human nature. Everybody goes after what's in his best interest. To which I always want to say, I wish people would really think about what's genuinely in their self-interest and then pursue it. But no, they're all strapping on the perceived obligations of giving back to the community. And we had the business roundtable just a few months ago telling us how they were going to do so much more for stakeholders and everything. And even when it's not good for the bottom line, et cetera, people feel guilty. So one point is simply that Rand does not subscribe to the idea that everybody always does, as a matter of fact, pursue what he thinks is in his best interest. That's a doctrine in philosophy known as psychological egoism, and she definitely rejects that. But she embraces the idea that you ought to pursue what's in your self-interest, that is the rational way to lead your life. Now, you need a lot of careful attention to what is genuinely in your interest, and that's another subject we can talk about. But so she wouldn't agree if von Mises held that people always do try to do what's best for them. No, Rand would disagree with that. There were at the same time, I think, some really important true ideas in other aspects of von Mises and some of his view, perhaps rhyming with Rand's, that I also, though, do want to come back to. Well, I guess the main thing would be this. Toward the very end, you were saying, there is no hive mind. There is no collective decision making in the way that it's often presented. And I think that's very true. In a way, it's a reflection of the same sort of issue I was referring to earlier when I said that, you can try to browbeat your son into believing X or not believing Y, but he will believe what he believes. I mean, heart of hearts, truth of his mind, a person can only think for himself and make decisions for himself. And we often give in to this vague catch-all kind of talk of, well, society declared or America wanted, when it's just a bunch of individuals. And it is extremely important, not just in economics or for reasons of productivity, to recognize that and respect that. It's a matter of individual rights, that this individual's life is his, and that's ultimately why he should get to make his own decisions about who to trade with. So even when we're talking the economics realm, like a von Mises is, there are tremendous practical benefits to come of respecting a free market. But even more fundamentally, it's the only way of respecting each person's right to his own life and to make his decisions and not to be forced into others. So obviously, there's many things we can pick up on in all these realms.
To stay on this, there's a couple other sort of approaches that come to mind that I'd love to get your reaction to. One is this, world of, I guess it's called evolutionary psychology. The Jonathan Haidt sort of frameworks and people sort of in that realm who were saying, I think Adam Smith actually would fall into this category, although he was intuiting it. So, like, to just paraphrase Smith, Smith's moral theory of moral sentiments is, attempts to construct a kind of description of why we have the moral inclinations that we do, and my understanding is that one of the things at the core of it is a desire to be loved and to be worthy of love. We want to be loved and to be lovely, and that I think more broadly is fed by the fact that we evolved in groups, and so we are individuals, we have individual minds, we make our individual choices, but one of the things that we rely on and that comforts us and that we require and is a social context or a group or a feeling of being part of a community. And it's why solitary confinement is like one of the most harsh forms of punishment, and it can actually lead to people going crazy when you're just deprived of social connection. How do you and how would Rand confront this sort of Smith, Haidt, Hume approach to where our morals come from, or where our moral intuitions come from?
Even though I do a lot of work in moral philosophy, this is not an area that I've looked into a lot. So here again, please take it for what it's worth. But a couple of things that have always struck me when I read a little bit about these evolutionary psychologists and so on is two quick thoughts. It seems to me too deterministic. And where do you go from here? Or what are you supposed to make of it? So it does not at all seem far-fetched to me that in the grand, just thousands and thousands and thousands of years history of humankind, it does not seem bizarre that, speaking from an evolutionary perspective, it was, conducive to human beings to develop certain inclinations, such as to take some pleasure in the company of other human beings and so on, for survival reasons, right? So it's not that I think that everything they say about what might have been the historical roots in evolutionary terms of our having some of the feelings that we do and emotional reactions that we tend to have, such as anger at injustice and so on, and how, there are plausible stories to be told, and that some of these people are telling about how that can have effects on the species' ability to survive in certain circumstances and so on. I think a lot of that can be true, but we are individuals who make our own choices. Now, that doesn't mean I'm an individual who is utterly detached from what it is to be an individual human being, born in 1961 and having this kind of life in this society, but having evolved from, I can't disown the past of the species or something, or the kind of being I am. But if I have free will, which, again, yes, we do. Even in having this conversation, we're both exercising it and making choices about some of what we're saying and not saying, questions we're raising, and so on, right? Then all of that becomes background to the choices I make and face today. And this is related to the other. So I said, there's a sense in which it seems to me too deterministic. What do you want to try to make out of it? And I think what some of these authors try to make out of it is a kind of, well, you see, where it's simply in the nature of the beast, the animal, the species, as opposed to Tara chose to do that. Maybe it was a good decision, maybe it was a bad decision, but she chose. It's as if they want to pin responsibility for behavior, good and bad, onto the species. Well, no, I think objectivism would have no truck with that. The individual makes his own choices. Again, that doesn't mean he makes choices in a vacuum. It doesn't mean that even as individuals, some of us might not have physical propensities that incline us in certain directions, that we might not have inherited, a certain genetic makeup from parents, or have family proclivities towards certain kinds of dependencies and addictions or whatever, right? I mean, all of that can be true, but speaking at the species level just doesn't seem to get at that. And that's more the issue that Rand is addressing, and that I'm interested in as a moral philosopher. And so again, that's related also to this question of what do you do with that? Or to the extent that there are truths to be told about the way we've evolved and some of why we may take pleasure in um, the favorable opinion of others, doesn't tell us how much we should count the favorable opinion of others, let alone, okay, what do I do now? What sorts of instruction should I draw from this? Sorry, that
Yeah.
got a little convoluted in my response there.
No, well, I have two sort of thoughts. I've got a thought and a question that, to play off of that. So my thought is that I think what you're saying sounds very similar in a lot of ways to the way Friedrich Hayek talked about, because I would also put him in some respects in this, somewhat evolutionary psychology sort of lineage, perhaps. But he said socialism is, to paraphrase, is essentially the reassertion of a tribal psychology that we only created civilization by escaping, which is to say, there's norms and there's intuitions and there's instincts that apply at the level of a 150 person or a 50 person tribe, that when you apply them to a modern multi-million person society, they don't work. They break. They break in horrific and historically fairly murderous ways as far as the history of the 20th century, be it Nazism or communism.
Mm-hmm.
So this sense of solidarity or nationalism or sharing and share alike, and where does that break when you have a big anonymous society? It's
Well, I
like,
think
yes,
it's
I
also
share with
it's
my
very
kids. I don't.
non-intellectual, right? It's like it's as if we are nothing but beasts or feelings and urges and instincts and all of these things, and man, they just drive us. Well, no, that doesn't seem to be the case.
But my question then is, how does that criticism square with starting objectivism around a set of assumptions or observations about what is human nature? Because isn't this the same conversation? Aren't we just trying to get
No, I
at
don't think
what our
so. And I
nature
think in
is?
some way, perhaps, I don't know, I think we've got some sort of disconnect here in what we mean by human nature, or no, I'm just because, yeah, I don't know. There's something about human nature that obviously is uh, striking you. So I'm not being clear, I guess. Um,
I mean, there's a bunch of things I want to move on to from here, but this feels like sort of the foundation that.
all things have, I mean, inanimate objects. If I look around the room, the book, the telephone, the eyeglasses, each of these things has a nature. An inanimate object, a squirrel has a nature. A human baby has a nature. A basil plant, a pecan tree has a nature. I mean, things have natures. We have to. Okay, let me invoke Francis Bacon. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. That idea, that principle, I think, is very much at the heart of the objectivist approach to the world. Things have natures, including human beings. We better figure out what that nature is so that we can figure out what needs, if any, we have. And yes, we have lots of needs. So that then we can figure out, what are we going to do about it? What sorts of actions do we have to take? What sorts of policies should we adopt such that we can meet our needs? So by invoking human nature, I simply mean to be invoking, yeah, there's a nature of human beings, and we need to pay attention to the fundamentals of that nature in order to be able to satisfy our needs and grow prosperous, happy, flourishing lives from there. So it's not like there is this, I don't know, again, there's something in the way that each of us is thinking about human nature that seems disconnected.
Well,
It's not that there's this given fixed, well, I mean, there are given fixed needs that we have, and obviously some of those can evolve over long periods of time. But
I think what you just said is a great place to sort of explore that and explore its implications in objectivism. And I watched your talks on happiness.
mm,
So
That's a nice topic.
you said, you just said about, our pursuit of happiness, or how do we do that?
Yeah.
And from an objectivist perspective, and from your perspective, what does that look like? What are these tenets? How do these tenets manifest as a guide? And I think one of the things that is interesting fundamentally, what I'm hearing in your, in your telling here, is these very much are oughts. These are recommendations. They're not mere observations. They are. Is that fair to say? I mean, this is a kind of code of ethics.
Oh, it's definitely a code of ethics that she is offering. Now, one important thing, and she's very explicit about this in one of the essays in particular, but there, on her view, there is no just, again, let's liken it to the Ten Commandments or something handed down from on high, be it from a religious authority, a man in the sky, or anything else. There is no set of moral edicts, thou shalt, which you, a good objectivist, are obligated to follow. Rather, again, and this comes back to the realism and the emphasis on causality that I referred to very quickly earlier. If you want to live and flourish, if you want, it's like, okay, I'm alive. Yeah, I like this life. I want it. I want to live. I want to be happy. I want to have a good life. Good in the sense of, yeah, this is the kind of life that feels worthwhile to me. If, and that's a crucial, critical if in Rand's view, if you want that, then given human nature, there are certain paths that are conducive to that, to your attaining it, and there are certain paths that are deleterious to your attaining it. So her code of ethics then tries to provide the path toward attaining happiness. So she is an egoist, as I said before. She believes in rational egoism, rational selfishness, the virtue of pursuing your own self-interest, your own happiness. But that requires a great deal of thought, of systematic, big picture thinking about what that is going to consist in for you, John, which is going to be different from for Jesse or from your wife or from me or from all sorts of other individuals, right? This goes back to something else I think that you were saying when you were talking about von Mises earlier, right? The individual, in a sense, customizes his particular version of a happiness or a good life. But she definitely is offering a code of ethics, which she identifies as the most helpful instructions for the fundamental kind of recurring issues that a person will face in life. So here, for instance, she fills in several virtues, moral virtues in her book, which are necessary, not sufficient, not a guarantee of happiness, but are necessary for human beings in principle to have the kind of flourishing lives that they might want. Principles, virtues such as, and we can, talk individually about some of these if you like, but honesty, justice, integrity, productiveness, independence, which I spoke of a little bit earlier in terms of talking about doing your own thinking and encouraging your son to do that, pride. So there are definitely the sort of master virtue of being rational in your approach to things. But then because there are certain kinds of questions or issues that one will repeatedly face, these are some of the basic guidelines that can help a person steer his course well, use his free will in a constructive way.
Yeah, so let's work our way through those, because I think that really is gonna, I think, answer a lot of questions that I have. And you touched on two of them in your talk, but let's go down as you listed them. So honesty. I think the critic, the sort of flat-footed strawman critic who hears the virtue of selfishness,
Right.
could easily say, well, obviously, if you
Yeah.
if all you care about is making yourself richer and happier and better off, that's going to lead you to stealing and fraud and
Right.
all kinds of
Lie, cheat,
deceptive,
deceive. Yeah, yeah.
Gordon Gekko, greed is good type stuff.
Right.
So, you started with honesty. Like, is that why is that? Why is that so important?
Because of the realism again. And what I mean is because faking things doesn't change them. I can pretend that things are other than they are. I can deliberately, knowingly misrepresent the way things are to you, to try to get a job from you, or to try to get you to lend me money, or for whatever reason, right? I can fake things to you. I can fake things to myself. Self-deception, I think, is a major part of the dishonesty that most people engage in, that people engage in more frequently than deception of others. But either way, the bottom line is, the fact is, faking things doesn't change them. The soon, like, I can pretend, if I get some bad medical report from the doctor, I can pretend not to have heard, the message that was left on the voicemail, right? I can pretend not to have heard what he said when he was showing me the radiology reports or whatever, but that doesn't make the tumor go away, right? I can pretend that I don't have this big debt on my credit card that I might be having and, deepening and worsening and so on, but it doesn't make it go away. Faking things doesn't change things. The sooner you face facts for what they are, the sooner you can start figuring out the best ways to deal with them. So it's a very, in a sense, metaphysics-based notion of why we should be honest, which is an interesting contrast to most of the conventional explanations of why people should be honest. And let me just back up with one parenthetical remark. As I reeled through that list of 6 or 7 virtues that Ayn Rand, as an egoist, would endorse, a few of them, particularly honesty and justice, you might think, well, gee, everybody likes honesty and justice. I mean, you don't have to be an atheist or an objectivist to think those are good. But what's interesting and noteworthy is that her rationales for the propriety of these things are different from the conventional rationale. I mean, usually people say, well, you should be honest because you'd want other people to be honest with you, or
Sort of the golden rule.
the golden rule, right? Or, oh, you'll be found out and you'll develop a bad reputation and that won't be good. Well, now that might be true, but that's not the core, the fundamental, the most basic reason for being honest. And again, her case for honesty is, even if there's nobody else around to fool, lying to yourself about your health, your finances, the state of your marriage, whatever it might be, doesn't really help yourself. So be honest, right? Doesn't mean you'll always like what the facts are, but at least you'll be in a better position to start dealing with them. And even to come back to the kind of example that you raised, which is perfectly natural and the common sort of example. When people hear about selfishness, they think, oh yeah, the selfish person is saying lie, cheat, steal. Do whatever he feels he should do to make a buck, to get that extra money. But notice what, I mean, even to say what a shallow notion of self-interest or happiness that is sort of to give it more credit than it deserves. So I meant very seriously the few times that I said, now you have to think seriously about what is in your self-interest and what is a happy life. That ain't it. That is having, the biggest pile of money on the island. And I think few of us on reflection would think that it is, would equate just having all the money in the world, like having the biggest pile of cash or whatever, that's the good life that we're after. We can come back to that too. But
yeah. So what? And I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think the internal turmoil that self-deception brings, I think a lot of people can recognize that either in themselves or in people they know who are just failing to come to terms with contradictions in their life or
and it's both. I mean, I like your word turmoil. I mean, it's both, to put it mildly, very unpleasant to live with inner tension. And right, I mean, because part of you always know, like the part that you're kind of not paying attention. When you're deceiving yourself about something, you're really trying to kid yourself about something or avoid thinking about something unpleasant. Like, part of you knows that you're doing that, right? Because it's self-deception. You're the deceiver, so part of you is aware of it, at least on some periphery of your consciousness. But part of you is also, oh, I'm enjoying the not thinking about that debt or that problem with my wife that I really should start addressing or whatever. So it's a very uncomfortable sort of state of flux to be in. But in addition to the turmoil and the tension, you're just putting off taking the kinds of steps that you might take to remedy a situation, or at least ameliorate it or make it better than it otherwise is. So it's self-destructive. Dishonesty is bad for you. It can be bad for other people as well if you're dishonest with them, for sure. I'm not denying that, right? That it can be to be dishonest with other people is manipulative and unjust and can be very destructive to those other people, but it's also self-destructive. Anyway, sorry, I always get excited about self-deception because I think it's what we're much more tempted toward. And, in saying this, and I fall into it sometimes, and I really got to call myself out. Tara, you're not, face this. What's going on here?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, and in some ways, this is probably, even though I think the differences are really important and the underlying reasons why honesty matters are important in their difference, it is probably in some respects the easiest starting point, coming in from the outside. Now, justice.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the harder ones relative to the myriad of meetings, that we hear out there in the world. I mean, I hear, justice.
Yeah.
I don't really know. I don't think I have a firm understanding of what anybody means by justice beyond the bumper stickers.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot to say on justice, one of my favorite virtues, but you're quite right. One of those on which her views perhaps most sharply or clearly to people defy convention, the conventional wisdom and understanding. So first, just what is justice in Rand's view? What is its essence? What does it consist in? Judging other people objectively and treating them accordingly, essentially. Now, let me say a little bit more to elaborate on that, but essentially, it's a matter of judging others. So you're judging other people here. You're not judging tomatoes in the supermarket or cars on the used car lot. You're judging people. Well, you need to judge them objectively. Go by the relevant evidence, relevant to the purpose for which you're judging the person. Am I judging the person to hire him as a car mechanic? Am I judging him as a tutor? Am I judging him to be a potential babysitter for my child? Or, like as a doctor, as a best friend, person to go into business with? So depending on the circumstances, the reason for which you're judging the person, go by the relevant evidence, go by logic and trying to assess it objectively, and then you act on it. You treat the person accordingly. It might be negatively, it might be positively, right? But you try to give the person what he deserves from you, which might be different from what he deserves from his mother or his wife or his best friend, But people often have these very vague, floaty ideas of what you deserve as if it's, well, the universe owes you something, or what you deserve from the cosmos. Justice is one-on-one. It's about how I treat, did I treat you fairly? Did I judge this student's paper objectively, properly, justly? Did you judge that job candidate appropriately, objectively, for the purpose for that kind of job, and so on? So it's a matter of judging people, but doing so objectively. And that means sometimes you don't, so she's a big believer that you have to judge people and there's nothing to apologize for. People love to go around quoting scripture, judge not and be not judged, or who are you to judge? Well, I'm a person who has interests. And my value, here's the basic reason why we should judge people. Everything I care about, everything you care about, John, it's subject to the impact of other people. Other people act in ways that affect your values. Sometimes they're trying to, sometimes they're not. It's quite inadvertent, right? Sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small. But, if you hire the wrong tutor, you could be wasting a lot of money. If you hire the wrong car mechanic, you could be endangering, the brakes or the safety of the car. If you hire the wrong babysitter, you're endangering your child in some way, right? So the things we care about are affected by the actions of others. That gives us good reason to screen other people and to care about the kinds of people we're dealing with and who we're encouraging and discouraging. So she definitely believes we need to judge people, but importantly, you need to judge them objectively. And if you don't have enough evidence on which to draw a conclusion, you need to say, I don't have enough evidence yet. So in saying, yes, you should judge people, she's not saying you should rush to judge people or judgment is an end in itself, but try to go by, the relevant evidence and so on. Be open to contrary evidence. If someone shows you what's wrong with the judgment that you were reaching about this job candidate, right? Listen to that. That's part of what's encompassed by being objective. But act accordingly as opposed to just, quote, love everybody. One of the so here's another of the nice, uncomfortable for most people implications of Rand's view. She doesn't think forgiveness is an unconditional good. Now that's sort of horrifying to many ears today. Like, oh my God, we're supposed to forgive people. And so, no, not necessarily, not always, not in all cases, by any means. I think there are some people who deserve forgiveness and should be forgiven, and there are others who don't. And there you've got to pay attention to what this person's done subsequent to the original transgression, right? Has he expressed remorse? Does it seem sincere? Is he doing anything to try to remedy his ways or to try to make it up to you in some way, right? Like, what's the evidence? So again, judge the person objectively. Some people can earn forgiveness, in which case it should be given, in which case it would be wrong not to forgive. But there is no unconditional duty to turn the other cheek or just pretend it didn't happen or let bygones be bygones. That would be suicidal. That would be stupid. That would be faking reality. So in a way, I think actually a lot of the case for justice mirrors the case for honesty more broadly. But here we're talking about interacting with others and judging others.
So,
But there's so many further directions you could go here. The attacks on merit today and meritocracy or egalitarianism or you name it. We could have a party talking about justice.
well, this is the area I wanted to. So I think there's a what you've outlined. If I want to summarize it and make sure I'm appreciating it, which and I agree with it, is that justice is a way of treating other people that's I think consistent with honesty and consistent with pursuing all the facts, so that what the judgment that you make is defensible, if nothing else.
No, that it's based on reasons. It's based on evidence. Well, here's why we didn't give you the raise this year, because you see, you didn't do this or you did that in the same. Yeah.
And and that sounds like it is a great way of also talking about the part of the use of justice that's the most sort of obvious, which is in the court of law and the justice system. So we obviously, if we are arrested and brought before a court of law on some charge, justice means that whatever the outcome of that is, it's accurate and proportional.
That's what we're going for. Yeah, right. I mean, no, I think
Right?
that's a great connection to bring up legal justice, because that's certainly an arena in which we've got these formal procedures designed to get at what actually happened, right? Now, as in all things, there's no guarantee that we won't make mistakes. I mean, I can judge you objectively, whether it's in the personal realm, this guy I transact business with, or this my brother-in-law, or this friend of the family, right? Or it can be in a court of law. I can judge objectively and be mistaken because, for instance, there was some evidence I wasn't aware of. I mean, let's make it a dramatic murder trial, right? The murder weapon may have only surfaced months after the verdict was reached, and there was no reason to suspect it was out there or suspect it would be found or belong to this person or that person, right? So, I mean, it could be that people comport themselves and they're thinking completely objectively, and they're really meticulous and conscientious and thorough, and they do all that they can do. Being objective doesn't make you infallible. And even a legal system, right, that has the best, most sensible policies on evidence and cross-examination of the opposing sides, witnesses, and so on, right? You can build in all sorts of safeguards, but they're not foolproof. They're not human proof in the sense that we could still make mistakes. But yeah, let me just come back to, but you're right that in a proper legal system, legal justice is trying to get at the way things really are, the facts. Did he do it? Did he pull the trigger? And, were there extenuating circumstances? And if so, what were they? And what are the reasons why we have to think that they were there? You're after accuracy. And that's what the objective judgment of any body or any issue should be after, trying to get reality right, so to speak.
And it's interesting because I think to linger on that for a moment, and I'm no legal expert, but the contentious nature of the plaintiff and the defendant's attorneys, that they are, what we are seeking and what our sort of rules of the game in the legal system, the Western legal system at least, is set up to do is to say, okay, the best way we can wring out emotional bias is to have both sides represented by people who will do everything right up to the boundary of the rules in pursuit of winning. And like one of the things that's interesting about that outcome that feels very consistent with the justice you're describing from Rand is the jury selection process. So, if any juror indicates some sort of emotional baggage or bias about the subject, like it's a trial of Bernie Madoff, and if a juror says, I hate billionaires, they're out. They get removed because they're supposed to be there to objectively judge the facts as they're presented. And so we set up the two lawyers to beat the hell out of each other in pursuit of wringing all that emotional dirty water out of the rag.
And right. And I think, I definitely think it does that, and that's one of the sought benefits of having that kind of fiercely adversarial system that we have in the U.S., at least in many Western countries, but not all. But it's also, this is the best way for the truth to come out. Not only even if we set aside concerns with bias, or once we've eliminated all the biases, let's say, or the players or the jurors who might be influenced by bias, still, it can be really hard to figure out what actually happened here because cases can be complicated, right? So having each side get to defend itself and press its case as vigorously as possible, the thought is the best way of having to give stronger, deeper reasoning for why your picture of what happened makes sense. And I mean, if you think again, just go to scientific research, at least ideally, right? We are challenging and contesting one another's hypotheses rigorously, almost savagely at times, right? But the point is, hey, if it's really understood at this point that this is true, then my more pressing, probing questions, he'll be able to give good answers to them. And if not, well, then that suggests there's still some question here, and maybe we shouldn't go fully here. So you're trying to get at the truth, and eliminating bias is one important aspect of it. I do think these days people have some very confused ideas about what bias is or what constitutes bias. Many people love to go around saying, oh, everybody's biased, and there's nothing you can do about it. Nobody is objective, which are completely self-defeating claims. And that infects just a lot, even beyond justice in the jury system or in the legal system. But yeah.
So now I want to and I want to leave us time to get to the others. But before we move on to integrity from justice, I want to ask this broader question, which is, so there's these other formulations of justice, which at some level I think all end up being some manner of group or collective, quote, justice or social justice.
Yeah.
So there's the Rawls.
Yes.
Sort of
That's what's come on in the last several decades. Yeah.
My understanding of at least the Rawls view is a just society is one that sort of maximizes the benefit of the people who are the most marginalized. And one way of one way of sort of judging whether a society is just is, would you,
Right.
in your sort of pre-birth consciousness,
Hmm.
would you choose to be born into that society if you had no idea where your station in life would be? So if you're presented with these two choices as this disembodied yet to be born consciousness. It's like, well, you can be born in North Korea and you might be the emperor, or you might be a peasant, or you could be born in the United States where you might be homeless or you might be Bill Gates. Pick. And on that count, America is more just than North Korea, but maybe it's less just than Sweden
Yeah.
or something like that.
I mean, you're right. That's the whole idea of justice has been socialized, so to speak. That we tend to, and I mean, John Rawls, the political philosopher at Harvard, primarily, I mean, he wrote his big book, his big, most influential book in the early 1970s. Since then, both the intellectuals and then it filters out into society more broadly, and not just American society, the whole concept of justice really has been perverted into domination by this social perspective. What's good for society, and what kind of society do you want to live in, or would you be content to live in? And notice that second way of putting it, or that question, is a completely subjectivist question. I mean, it's you mentioned the golden rule earlier. It's like, would you be okay with this? Would that, as if, hey, if I would be okay with this, that's justified, that's valid, that's the last thing that can be said on an issue. Well, okay.
Yeah, if you've got some sadistic or masochistic quirks, it sort of breaks that logic pretty quickly.
Part of what's interesting, I started out in talking about justice by giving her basic concept of it: judge people objectively, treat them as they deserve. That, in the history of thinking, in the history of philosophy, her account of justice is actually pretty in sync with the kinds of accounts you often find in, to some extent, in the Bible, in the early Greeks, in Augustine, in Aquinas, in a number of, I mean, the basic idea of judging people on their merits, or it's being unfair to punish the innocent, or to or to scapegoat a person. I mean, those core ideas of fairness and unfairness are even articulated in language very close to Rand's historically. And I do, again, I would stress that one of the aspects I mentioned is justice is one-on-one. It's like you judge the person for what he's worth in this relationship to you. But this sort of collectivist socialist perspective on justice that you raise, we see it, for instance, in debates today about what's a fair wage. When people talk about the economy, when people talk about minimum wages, or people talk about people who work at fast food places or what, oh, that's not fair, that's ridiculous, or it's not fair that these people have so much money. And these notions of fairness that are brought in usually incorporate unspoken these massive assumptions, as if it's unjust from the point of view of the universe or the cosmos again, right? Or the point of view, I mean, that's a variation of from the point of view of society. But it's, which I think is a completely wrong-headed approach. If I want to pay so-and-so $10 an hour to do such and such a job, right? He has a choice to take it or leave it. Now, he may not have a lot of more attractive options, but hey, I'm giving him one option. Do this work for me for $10 an hour. Take it or leave it. It's up to you, right? What's unfair about that? I'm not forcing him to take it. Maybe there are other people who in other aspects of his life have treated him unfairly, but that's another issue, right? But we adopt just without even thinking, and we often fall into this thinking of, well, that's unfair, as if to say, if I were master of the universe and controlled everybody's prices and wages and products and hours of labor and so on, I would make it such that everybody could have $15 an hour, or whatever it might be. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about, right? It's, at any rate, I just think that's an example of the ways in which we collectivize and we talk about distributive justice, another concept that really grew largely in the aftermath of Rawls. Distributive justice. And now you have people talking about contributive justice. It's what do you do for society? And that's what justice is. This is a complete distortion of what the concept of justice is all about. There may be other social ideals that people want to talk about in making a society quote, better in some respects, and I have a lot, of questions about whether those make sense, but we just cloud the justice issue by, in a sense, injecting altruism into its bloodstream such that people think the perspective of serving the larger good is the lens through which we've got to view justice. So there, I've thrown in, I don't know, 4 different metaphors in there. Sorry about that.
Well, I
Take
would
one,
say
anyone, whichever one you like.
the thing I find interesting about at least the Rawls formulation,
Mm-hmm.
the Rawls formulation is interesting because, as a matter of fact,
Mm-hmm.
you can pretty quickly make the case that, well, based on Rawls, capitalist Western societies win, because if I'm in the veil of ignorance, I sure as hell would rather be born and roll the dice in a Western capitalist society than any other society in all of human history.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so there's a kind of just historical consequentialist, like outcomes based
Yeah.
reality there. It's like, okay, I see your framework, and I present to you the lifestyles of the bottom 10% comparatively across all societies. And okay, you like Sweden? Well, Sweden's actually way more close to laissez-faire capitalism than it is to the other frameworks. So great, all right, fine.
Yeah.
But
And
I
let me just
think
throw
I
in one
think
more thing.
yeah,
If
please.
I can, just one thing more about injustice, and in particular in the economic realm, because we hear so much today about equality. Um, you know, and oh my God, there are all these gaps, and some people have so much more money than others. In itself, that tells you nothing about justice or fairness. You've got to look at, how did this guy get the money he's got? What did he do? What did he create? How did people buy the product willingly, and so on? But what we don't talk about is the injustice done to the people from whom we would take, no, you have to pay this wage. So even when it's just at that level of the small business owner, you have to pay this wage to these people. You have to give this person this many weeks off when such and such happens in her life, and so on. What about that person? I mean, there's the image of the big, bleeding heart, the loving. It's very selective, this kind of social justice. It's very selective in who it's, quote, kind to. And it basically says, and to hell, to put it kindly, to hell with those of you from whom we are going to take, whether or not you want to, such that we can raise these other people up. A good book, by the way, that I would recommend is called Equal is Unfair, written by a former head of the Ayn Rand Institute, Yaron Brook, and Don Watkins. It's co-authored by Watkins and Brook. Equal is Unfair. Really nice analysis from an objectivist perspective of what's wrong with the whole notion, the whole assumption that that the more fair, the more just is the more equal. Anyway, I
Yeah,
just thought I'd get that in.
I think to put a button on the justice pillar, it sure seems like you have you have Rand and objectivist, and I would say perhaps some kind of classical justice, as it's embodied in our legal system, and in like as you said, sort of the philosophers of the West.
Mm.
And then you have justice as a proxy for equal outcomes.
Yeah, and
And
that's what it's increasingly become in people's minds, which is
and
really
it
pernicious.
and I think that there's a seductiveness to that even the sort of evolutionary psychology folks point at, which is we evolved in this zero sum world where if somebody had a lot of berries, they in some sense really did take them at the expense of others. And so
Sure.
we
Oh,
have
there
this,
have been injustices in this world for sure. Yeah.
yeah, even if they took them from the tree and didn't take them from your hut, there's only so many trees around that we have access to before the tigers kill us. So, if we don't share and share alike, we all die alone. And so we've got this sort of deeply ingrained sense of proportionality as fairness.
Oh, uh-huh.
But I think that again, to come back to Hayek, that ethos, that evolved ethos, doesn't it tricks us because we live in a world where what Jeff Bezos did by and large is create entirely new things. So, he has a huge pile of berries because he invented more trees. He didn't take them from you or from anyone else.
Right. Natural resources are just that. They're resources, but they've got to be exploited by people. Yeah, that dirty word, exploited. Human beings have to figure out what the hell can we do with that stuff to make it useful. And they do. They think, my God, you and I are so lucky to live when and where we live, and like all the amazing things that people have figured out how to do, such that we could be having this conversation as we are right now across these technologies and so on. Right. And it's the persons who bring the who create the value in the things which are simply dormant, potentially of value to people, until some people figure out what to do with them and how to make them valuable. And then when they've done that, they are entitled to say, okay, if you want to share in what I've done, if you want to get a piece of it, if you want to apply what I've done, pay me this. Yeah.
So before we move on to integrity, I think maybe it'd be worthwhile to address this issue of altruism versus selfishness, because I think this context of equal outcomes and justice, really does draw us to focus on, well, why don't you want to help people? What, is there anything higher than being in the service of others? Isn't being in the service of others our highest calling and our highest opportunity to find happiness?
Uh-huh.
And so help me understand, because if there's one thing that you can find out about Ayn Rand pretty quickly with pretty little effort, is she celebrates, quote, selfishness, and really takes altruism out to the woodshed.
Yeah, no, and this is, definitely, this is an absolutely core issue in objectivism. So it's a really important and good one for us to talk about. Yeah, she unapologetically endorses and embraces selfishness. Rational egoism, she stresses. There have been other versions of egoism propounded by other philosophers over the years. There's a lot that her egoism is not and does not mean. It's not emotionalism. It's not materialism, where the only value in the world is material or money. It's not subjectivism. It's not whatever I think is in my interest is in my interest. No, again, there's a nature, there's a reality of certain needs that human beings have, and you've got to figure out what those needs are. And in particular, then for your individual case, what are some of the things that would compose a happy, flourishing life? It's not, I forget other things of it. It's not subjectivist. It's not predatory. It's not, and this actually starts feeding us more directly into the altruism. Pursuing my self-interest and actually attaining my self-interest does not come at the cost of other people. So in advocating egoism, she is not advocating exploitation of other people. I think because most of us are raised more or less explicitly or subtly on the ethic of altruism, and altruism calls for self-sacrifice, right? Put the other guy first. Do for others. Give up some of your spring break to go hammer up Habitat for Humanity houses, or to go tutor people in, southern Mississippi or South America or wherever it might be, right? Give up, sacrifice, defer, give. Because altruism preaches sacrifice yourself to others, people assume that egoism must say the opposite. It must command sacrifice others to you, to whatever you want or whatever you think is good for you. That's not what Rand is advocating.
So what is she advocating then?
Pursuit of your happiness. One way I like to think of it is, most of us, when we attend, let's say, a college commencement, and you're there for a certain graduate, let's say, in the family, or you attend a wedding, and you wish the young person, the young people, all the happiness in the world, as we often do, right? All the success and so on. what is the kind of life that you're envisioning for this person, right? Just broadly, what sorts of things do you want? And you really want that person to have a life of balanced values and healthy values and growth and spiritual satisfaction. By it's not just that he has a paycheck at the end of every week, but he enjoys what he's doing. He finds it rewarding and challenging in certain ways, and he's not just settling for some job that's very much beneath his abilities, but man, he can stay in that job for the next 8 years or something. No, I mean, we want a person to flourish. And so egoism says, yeah, want that for yourself and go after it for yourself. So in a certain sense, I do think of egoism as the pursuit of happiness, of a good life for yourself, having to think long and hard about, well, now how am I going to make this good life for myself? I really want to be I really want to write plays, but it's really hard to make a living writing plays and so on. So what kind of work can I do that might be conducive to that, but isn't going to take so much of my energy away that I have nothing left to give when I need to actually be writing my plays or whatever? I mean, there are all sorts of factors, health factors, personal family factors that can make this complicated to figure out what is in particulars the best kind of life for you. But I mean, Rand's thought is, in a sense, look, we're all mortal. We only have so many years. This is what you get. Make the most of it. But by Tara's pursuing her self-interest in a rational way, guided by the virtues of honesty and integrity and productiveness and the other virtues that we've been talking about, some we've talked about, some we haven't talked about, right? Guided by these virtues, if I do that, and John does that, and Mary Jones does that, and Amelia does that, no skin off my nose that you're pursuing your happiness in a rational way. If you're pursuing it in an irrational way, defying the principles of honesty or justice and so on, then I better look out. Then I better watch my wallet, right? But I mean, business people will often talk about free business as a win-win situation, right? Where two parties transact business because they both can gain by doing so, right? It's a mutually beneficial relationship that you can have with other people. So going back to one of the first things in your question about altruism, Rand's position is not don't help other people, screw them, everybody for himself, and I never give a dime to anybody. No, it's certainly completely compatible with the rational pursuit of my self-interest for me to value certain individuals, not anybody or everybody, right? But I might value certain individuals a great deal. I might value certain causes, such as the Ayn Rand Institute, a great deal, right? Causes, certain missions, and so on, such that I want to give to them and can give to them compatibly with my pursuing my own self-interest. That is, there is no duty to give to others on Rand's view, and you should never sacrifice yourself for others. But well short of sacrificing myself to others, if I have some discretionary income that I can afford to give to a friend who's struggling, let's say, through a certain period through no fault of his own or something, it's perfectly sensible to give in such circumstances. So by the way, I mean, if people are interested in this, she has an essay, I think it's called The Ethics of Emergencies, in which she talks a little bit about charity. I have a chapter in my book, so I will plug one of my books here. I have a book called Ayn Rand's Normative Ethics, and it's all about her theory of the virtues. And even while she didn't consider charity or generosity a virtue, like a positive, you should always be on the lookout to do these things or respond in these ways, I have a chapter in which I talk about a few of the widely considered virtues, such as charity and generosity, to say, well, now, how does Rand's theory square with these? So I would really recommend that chapter in my book, available at Amazon, Ayn Rand's Normative Ethics. So she does address this. She is not saying you should never help people, but you should never sacrifice. You should not treat other people's well-being as more valuable than one's own. But there can be special circumstances in which a person is so valuable to you. Perhaps your son, John, for instance, there would be circumstances in which you would risk your life for him because your life wouldn't be worth having without him.
Yeah, no question about it. Not, it wouldn't even, um,
You wouldn't have to think too long and
wouldn't even
hard.
have to think too an
Right,
instant.
but that sounds like
We're
because
yeah.
you have the integrity of that value actually being a value to you. Yeah.
The one of the things I'm struck by in because I have had some rich conversations about this with other folks who are objectivists. One of the things I'm struck by with this tension around altruism and this sense of selfishness, because I think the word selfishness has other baggage,
It has a
whether
lot
it's
of baggage,
that
obviously.
that
Yeah,
is, I think there's a semantics and a language problem, that this is probably the weakest area from a marketing perspective.
well, it's got an image problem, selfishness.
For Rand's ideas. Well, what the way I think about it is, there's, if you think of this sort of I don't know if it's Clay Christensen who sort of laid out, there's a kind of adoption curve for products and for ideas, and sort of early in the curve, early adopters are the sort who revel in the new or even in the provocative. And I think Rand's tone and the provocativeness of her assault on altruism was sort of purpose built, or perfectly built for that early stage adopter, and then really runs up against a wall with these later stages.
But I do want to say something on that because, right, I mean, obviously, you praise selfishness, you turn a lot of people off. However, uh, I guess there's a sense in which she wanted to provoke. Not for the sake of being provocative or being the rebel, but to really, it's like to grab people by the collar and say, think about what it means when you say you should be selfless. I mean, no more, for instance, wishing happiness to that kid who's graduating. I mean, to hell with you, kid. If your selfishness, if your pursuit of your happiness is an evil thing, then I should wish for you, just a life of service and all right. And I should wish that for myself and so on. So part of what she wants to do is get us to really think about what is self-interest. So in that sense, while on the one hand, I understand there's an image problem when you talk about selfishness. Part of why she's using the word is because, but that is what she is advocating. That is the thoughtful advance of yourself's flourishing, happiness, prosperity. Again, it's like, yeah, that is it. So she doesn't want to dodge the issue. She doesn't want to kind of soft sell. It's like, no, let's confront what I'm really talking about, because it is a radical inversion from the service that we are all, raised and acclimated to advance.
I think something that I find sort of interesting about this is that at one level, it is provocative and discomforting for folks, and you need to have a certain level of openness and willingness to explore ideas in spite of your gut reactions,
Mm-hmm.
to get past that. Oh no, that sounds like evil. That sounds like, that's like a 10. Come on, the 10 Commandments. But the other angle that I find so interesting is it's very similar to what you hear at an AA meeting, or or in a prison rehabilitation program, where where people. I mean, I've done a lot of work around this. I've in terms of my filmmaking, our film The Pursuit. We spent a lot of time with folks that are at the margins of society, at a homeless program in New York and a prison entrepreneurship program in Houston.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's in the film. One of the guys in New York who's a formerly homeless man, and now he's a leader in this organization. He says it. He says, before you can love anybody else, you got to love yourself. And he's saying this to people who have lived lives that have not sort of, that have been self-destructive, and he having lived that, lays it right at the feet at a failure to sort of take yourself seriously, to love yourself, to put yourself and your own development ahead of
Mm-hmm.
what is often your peers, or your circumstances. And I think you hear that, quite Randian sort of call in a lot of domains. And a lot of times you hear it precisely in the environments where you're trying to help people who are marginalized or are having problems, psychological problems or family problems or marital problems. I mean, how many marriage counselors have said, like, you hate yourself, so how can you love your spouse? Like,
No, I mean, I think part of it is what I just muttered in there was something like reality is a great time. It's being honest. And I think part of too what scares people when they hear ego, I said, right, it's got to, bad image problems, bad branding, and so on. You might think, right? But I don't think it's. I mean, I think we should talk about selfishness, and that she was right to call it the virtue of selfishness, because it's like, this is what I'm talking about. I don't want to fudge it. I don't want to pretend or soft sell it as if it's something else. It is radically different from the ethics of give all you have to the poor, of Michelle Obama saying service is the rent we pay for living. No, Rand thinks you don't pay rent. Your life is yours, and you don't have anything to apologize for it. So even when we talk about the AA or the helpless, the homeless and so on that you were just raising, her view isn't simply you got to love yourself before you can or so that you can love everybody else. It's what is it to value things? And I think part of what uh, disturbs or alarms people about Rand's coming out for selfishness is there's something really honest about it. And I think that's at the core of a lot of people's reactions to the fiction when they first read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. It's like, oh my God, this woman is naming the things that I always had some, at least dim doubts about on the corners of my mind, but nobody ever seemed to talk about them. So I didn't talk about them or really think about them either. But, if you really think about this altruism stuff, this self-sacrifice stuff, then I guess I really should give all my belongings and go the Peter Singer route and, live on as few calories. And there are all these people doing this kind of thing today, and just minimize my footprint. But I mean, if you really take that seriously, we're talking about radically, dramatically different kinds of lives than you or I certainly in this society are leading, right? Well, nobody wants to be that honest or that consistent, so they fudge and they pay lip service to, well, of course you got to be a little bit selfish, or of course you got to love yourself so that you can be a good husband or a good father or whatever. She's saying, no, let's not fudge it. Let's look for, in principle, how do people prosper? What makes them succeed? Do they owe their lives to other people or not? So she's forcing the issue, but I think that's really good. And I think it's because she takes ideas seriously. She takes values seriously. And, you were saying you have to take yourself seriously before you can take other people seriously. Yeah, you've got to take what it is to truly value something as opposed to pay lip service to uh, giving back or the value of others.
one little side note before we move on to integrity is I often find the broader conversations that are built on these ethics kind of silly, in the sense that, you brought up Peter Singer. Peter Singer, if nothing else, is absolutely consistent in his utilitarianism. So from his perspective, it doesn't stop at the borders of your country like most people's sort of political altruism, where it's, well, we need to level the playing field and we need to redistribute everything and make sure everybody's equal. But we shouldn't do that for anybody that's living outside of the United States. So we shouldn't. In fact,
there are always these convenient and sort of not talked about corners or limitations. Yeah, of course.
yeah. So there's no sense in which,
When you have irrational ideas, you have to cheat on them.
Yeah, there's a very it's a very convenient national. It's a very convenient and inevitably sort of nationalist, charitable ethos there, because, like, well, we can't have open borders because then we won't have support for the welfare state. So we have to leave people in desperate poverty in Haiti who want to come to America so that we can have equality here.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll tell them to raise their minimum wage and that'll help them out. Like, it's a very strange. You really get tied in knots once you try to bring. I mean, at least you could say contra Rand, at least the communists had a global, we got to make everybody, we got to make the planet
Make everybody
communist.
miserable.
So integrity, and to make sure we get through some of the others, we don't have to spend as much time on this, as important as it is, but we've probably touched on a lot of aspects of it. But what do you mean by integrity? What does she mean by integrity?
Well, living by your principles, living by your convictions. If you have values, if you really have certain beliefs about what's important and the proper principles for leading your life, you actually act that way. You do practice what you preach. So, in a way, I think of this one in some ways as simpler than some of the others we've been talking about, but it's being an integrated person, a seamless person whose thoughts aren't just talk or just words or just ideas, but he puts them into practice. So he lives in action, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, he lives what he believes. And he takes ideas seriously enough that, no, this is for action. And I'm not going to say that I believe something unless I'm willing to act on it. And if I find myself having serious doubts about whether I should act on it, I'll reconsider, have I made a mistake about what I should be doing or not? But I'll be honest with myself in thinking about that too. Because sometimes it's like, no, you do believe that that's the best principle here, and the fact that you would be a little uncomfortable because so and so would think of you in such a way if you did the just thing here and didn't forgive him, well, so be it. So Rand had this, getting back to metaphysics, the mind and the body are one in a person. They're not two disjointed, sort of, one is from Venus and one is from Mars. You are a mind and a body, and your physical actions and all of your actions should be of a piece with your mind running the show. So live by reason. Again, if that's our master virtue, be rational, live by reason, lead your life, make your choices, draw your conclusions, make your decisions by reason. Integrity is the form in which we do that. And again, it's not, I think sometimes we have this image of integrity of, oh, it's a lovely thing. It's beautiful. It's aesthetically very pleasing. It's clean. If you see an example of integrity in a movie or a book, it's very inspiring. And it is. But it's not just a little beautiful thing in its own right. It's practical. All of ethics, this code of living, is practical. It's all geared to helping you have the best kind of life you have. So if you've thought long and hard about proper principles and values and virtues in your life, then it makes sense to live on them. And if these really make sense, it would be self-defeating to cheat on them. So it's reminding yourself sometimes of that bigger picture and how, no, honesty really is the way to go. That can help get you through the challenging times, or the times when you're kind of tempted to cheat.
So, in a way, integrity is honesty and justice played out in action in your life and the choices
I mean, I
you
do
make.
think that's a lot of what you means by it is simply this: you actually live by it. You're of a piece such that what you do and what you say and think matches up. Now, people love, I mean, it's great sport to charge other people with hypocrisy. And I have to, and God knows more than ever in the last several years, you have to also get to what is the content of what the person believes. That is, it's not that it's a very bad thing to be a hypocrite, but sometimes the criticism of those who disagree with us as, oh, they're just hypocrites, all those Dems or all those Republicans or whoever it might be, is such a shallow, easy sort of criticism to lodge that often, at least, really avoids the more serious issues of what is it that these people preach, what is it that these people believe or claim to espouse, and what's wrong with it. And we can learn so much more so often from investigating that. But it's just sort of cheap way of scoring points to say, oh, but he's inconsistent about this, or he doesn't really practice what he preaches. Again, it's a serious problem, but it's not the deepest problem. And in a lot of contemporary political debate, for instance, it really skirts the deeper issues.
So, in your talk on happiness, you focused on pride and productiveness. And I thought that was very interesting. And having spent, several years working with Arthur Brooks, who puts work at the
You used
center
to
of
work
his.
at his.
No, I directed a movie called The Pursuit that's on Netflix,
Oh, okay.
and it's about a lot of these ideas we're discussing. It's about the role of capitalism and lifting people up around the world, and it's also about the role of
Didn't know that. I'll have to. So it's called Pursuit.
The pursuit.
Oh, okay. The Pursuit. Good.
But it's also about how work, and it's not make work, productive work is one of the single greatest sources of satisfaction and happiness that's within our control. And it really resonated the way you talked about it. So lay out for me what you mean by productiveness and why that's such an important virtue and such an important foundation for a happy life.
Keep coming back to this reality thing that I mentioned at the very beginning. You know, Rand's philosophy respects the nature of reality, and the nature of the reality of human beings and our needs is we've got to create values. We've got to make material values to sustain ourselves first, just at the most basic level of a roof over the head, shoes on the foot, warm clothing for the cold weather, and, food in the belly and all of that. But much, and then you graduate up from there. We need and we thrive on being able to meet our needs more and more easily and more readily. But the fact is, we're not born in the Garden of Eden. We're not born with just milk and honey flowing from the trees and so on. Money doesn't grow on trees, as our mothers, we hope, told us, right? We've got to produce. So Rand means the creation of material values. We need to create, we need to create material values. That's why this is a virtue, because, it's the nature of human beings that we need to. But we do feel, I think you mentioned the sense that people derive great satisfaction. It's natural that we would, because we're meeting a need, and there's a sense of efficacy. I mean, efficacy, I think, now I'm not a parent, so I didn't have the pleasure of observing this firsthand. I don't have any sort of small children nearby in the family either. But I mean, I'm sure you have observed it's a terrific, empowering feeling for a small child, even, to be able to do something that he wanted to do. And I'm talking here at the most primitive level of, he put the ball over there, or, he was able to do some small task. Being efficacious, having a will and then enacting it, or, I have a goal and I'm able to achieve that goal, feeling efficacious, it's a wonderful thing. It gives you evidence that you are able to control your environment somewhat, or, if control is too strong a word, to make more around you the way you would like it to be. And that's what productiveness as a virtue is. That's what productive people, coming back to some of the people in the economy that you brought up, Bezos, I think, before, but so many, the world famous and the no names, who create valuable goods and services that, whether it just be the pizza joint or the dry cleaners down the block or whatever the service or good might be, they're creating values. Values are the things that we live on. They're the, that's sort of the broader concept for, the meat and the shoes, but all the different kinds of things that enrich our lives and enable them to be enjoyable and satisfying, and the kinds of lives we want to continue having.
It's funny because I'm working on a new project that's exploring what's happened in early childhood as a result of what's become over it's called snowplow parenting, overprotective, or helicopter parenting. And one of the things that has happened is, objectively, there's been a stark rise in over a few decades, but especially for those born after 1995, in anxiety and depression and a feeling of helplessness.
No, I know,
And
I've read this. Yeah,
and I'm
makes
sure
sense.
as a college professor, I think you're getting hit with this in the form of the safe space craziness and this sort of the mental health departments at major universities being having lines out the door when I went to Penn State back in 96. Like, I didn't even know where that, I didn't even know where it was, and I didn't know anybody else. I mean, obviously there's always people that have legitimate mental health issues, and at the core, in many ways of that crisis seems to be the disempowerment that comes from not having a chance
Yeah.
to be effective on your own. When your mom or dad is always tying your shoes for you and never lets you do it, and is
You don't learn how to do it, and you don't learn confidence that you can do it. If anything, that sends the message, you can't, so I'd better do it for you.
yeah,
Right? I mean, that's the implicit message that unfortunately these kids get. Yeah. And I think in a way it relates to another virtue, the virtue of pride, which you also mentioned, right? Pride is necessary for the value of self-esteem. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of kids raised under an ethos so 30 or 35 years ago, there became a vogue in promoting children's self-esteem. But it was based on a very misguided idea of how to do that and what self-esteem is. Uh, and I mean, most laughably, it all had to do with uh, if we esteem you, you will have self-esteem. If we give you trophies for showing up, essentially, not for excelling or besting the others in a particular competition or anything, if we just praise just about everything you do, you will absorb the idea that you're really pretty hot stuff. Well, kids aren't stupid. They didn't absorb that idea. And actual self-esteem, which is, I esteem myself and I have good reasons for doing so, right? That was sort of displanted or displaced such that you're raising kids who don't have self-esteem. Then, you couple that with the more recent helicopter parenting kind of motif of the parents take care of everything. The kid doesn't exercise responsibility, therefore doesn't learn to be efficacious about anything that really matters, therefore suffers anxiety, right, which is just sort of the opposite of self-confidence, of self-esteem, which again has to be earned. And I mean, there's a lot more we can say about self-esteem, but I mean, I think one of the lessons here too is bad philosophy has effects. It's not just, hey, if I don't produce, I don't have bread on the table tonight. If I'm adopting misguided ideas about, well, I should always be serving others, for instance, or I'm not to be independent. It's okay to be dependent on mommy and daddy, or they want me to be dependent, right? Or I should have this convoluted idea of self-esteem of why I'm good. That's not going to actually work. It's not going to actually be practical for people. And one of the results, very sadly and tragically for people who suffer, is this anxiety and this depression and just this sort of malaise that a lot of people feel about their lives. So you can't get away with wrong ideas, and that's part of what Rand is trying to, is calling attention to. You need the right ideas, and you need to practice them consistently in order to be happy.
One of the things that you had brought up in your talk was that, and it was really potent as a concept, that happiness isn't something you can give to other people, because it necessarily originates with yourself. I'd say the same thing is true of morality. You can't force moral actions.
Yeah.
You can't force somebody to be moral, because if you're forcing them to do it, it's not really
it's not their choice,
to begin
right?
with. So
Right.
you can't.
It's just to placate you, but yeah.
But talk about that and how that connects to both this sense of productiveness and pride, because I think that was it's a pretty deep, I think, insight that can be pretty hard to grapple with.
I'm very glad you pick up on that point, though, because I do think it's so crucial and so important. I forget, I think I put it in a few different ways, but happiness is the kind of thing that is necessarily self-generated. I mean, obviously, other people can do all sorts of things that are very beneficial for us. We can help. I mean, human beings can and do help one another in profoundly valuable ways. I mean, and I'm not just talking about, oh, you can give all this money to this person, which can do great good for them, particularly in certain circumstances, pay off their debt or pay their tuition or pay for that expensive medical treatment that they might need and so on. But if you just think about, the really good friend, the understanding friend with whom you have a certain kind of, man, you're both very in harmony on certain really important things or relationships or whatever, and the kinds of probing and truthful conversations you can have with certain friends. I mean, that's a tremendous value to a person. There are all sorts of values people can give to one another. But when you think about the core of what happiness is, what having a good life is, being contented with your life, feeling like, yeah, this is good. I mean, obviously, we all suffer setbacks and frustrations on a day-to-day basis, but there's a sense that you can have and frequently will have in a well-led life that my life, this is basically good. This is going in a good direction. This is satisfying. I like this. I want more of this, right? How do you get that? That is not the kind of thing that anybody else can give you. They can't serve it up. Even the people who know you the best, who are closest to you, who love you the most, who want the most for you, you can't make another person happy. You can't make another person think of his life in a certain way if he doesn't think it. You can't make this may be even more important, you can't make another person think of himself in a certain way. A person isn't going to have self-respect and self-love and like, yeah, this is good. I'm good. This is a great thing. This getting up in the morning and getting to do all this. If I don't feel that myself, if I don't think that myself, there is nothing that those who love me can give me that's going to give me that. But I think that this really is a pivot to, this is why it makes sense for everybody to go after his own happiness. Again, to think long and hard about what really is the exact recipe for Tara's best happiness or John's best happiness and so on. But, to give that on an ongoing basis, serious reflection and to go after it. And I think that, the more people who do that, the happier more people would be.
Tara, I want to thank you for sharing all this with me today.
Sure, this has been really interesting.
It's been
I've enjoyed your questions and your interests. It's been a lot of fun.
And I think it's you've left me with a lot. And I think for those that made it to this point in the conversation, have left all of us with a lot to think about as we think about how to live the best life we can live, and both for ourselves and for the people that we care about. So I really appreciate it.
Well, sure. Thank you very much. Happy New Year. Underscore the happy there, but a really happy New Year to you and all of your family. And thanks a lot for having me.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.